President Wilson Tan and other officers and members of FINEX, my fellow speakers, and our moderator, Riza Mantaring. From the outset, let me say that in your language of application and sources of funds, I will focus on the application. And I will leave it up to Diwa and company to sort out all the difficulties in the sourcing. I definitely agree with what has already been done. Removing SSS, GSIS, and I also would want to remove the central bank. And I would include, and I will explain why, DPP and Land Bank, plus all the multilateral institutions that, as I will explain, can have a tremendous interest in an instrument that I call the Philippine Long-Term Investment Fund, in place of the Maharlika Investment Fund, and already addressing the politicization of this instrument. Let's remove Maharlika. I don't think it's essential to the concept of a long-term investment fund. And I would just like to put in the context of what I think can and should happen to the Philippines in the next 6 to 10 years. So in a way, I'm giving you the context in which I think the Philippine Long-Term Investment Fund is a very important instrument for attaining the objectives I will mention. In my scenario, and some of you have attended briefings you have been giving, a 6 to 7% GDP growth rate is already assured for the next 5 years. Even if the present administration just respects all the strong institutions and reformed economic policies that have been results of 30 years of slow and painful reforms. We have reached a critical mass in which a 6 to 7% growth is very much within our reach. And we want to take a look at the immediate past from 2011, 2019, a period shared by two different presidents. 6 to 7% was systematically attained. Actually, the graph, I'm not using the graph here, but you can see it from certain graphs that appear about that period. Now, 6 to 7%, in my opinion, is not sufficient for Secretary Rosario and company to attain their single-digit poverty incidence rate by the end of the Marcos administration. We have to accelerate the growth rate to 8 to 10%. And in my opinion, that is doable. How? I, quote unquote, as a teacher, will give an assignment to our president. He just admitted that he took a course in UANP and he did not complete the certificate, he said, so I can still give him 3 assignments. Number 1, he has to make sure that under his watch, agriculture will grow at least at 2 to 3% a year. In contrast with the negative growth we've had over the last 3 years. I'm sure you've noticed that over the last 3 years, agriculture was minus, minus, minus. Now, where do I get the 2 to 3%? If I take a look at the 2 most successful Southeast Asian economies, agriculture, Thailand and Vietnam, they have not grown at more than 2 to 3% in agriculture year in, year out over the last 10 years. So agriculture is very difficult to grow with all the uncertainties, but 2 to 3% will be accessible if we have a lot of large-scale corporate farming, starting with consolidating 3.5 million hectares of coconuts that have been splintered because of agrarian reform, that now can have models that will follow the example of the Malaysian nucleus estate system, which made Malaysia #1 in the production of palm oil when they still had a lot of workers. Now, it's Indonesia that's taken over, and a lot, probably, I'm glad that you have the MCI as one of your sponsors. They're going big in palm oil in Negros and Mindanao, precisely because raising a lot of farms, both private and public. Now, that requires billions of dollars of investments, which we do not have within our reach. It is not talked about a lot, and I am surprised why our statisticians do not quote this figure. Do you know that our gross savings rate to GDP is at an abysmally low of 9% of GDP? You know, many times we shout for joy, revenge spending, revenge traveling, consumption is now making our economy grow at 6 to 7%. Okay, that's very good for cars, for food and dining, for travel, but the dark side is we have absolutely no savings for long-term investment. The only alternative, and thanks to the Public Service Act amendment, you know, there are two things that Duterte will remember for positively. First is the build. He was able to bring the percentage of infrastructure to 5 to 6%, much more than the 2% average we had over a 30-year period. And second was, in his government, we were able to finally open up practically all strategic infrastructure sectors, airports, trains, name it, subways, etc., to 100% foreign equity. And that is why my second assignment to the president is he has to increase the rate of investment to GDP from the low of 22 to 23, which we have now, to the average of the tiger economies, which is anywhere from 25 to 35%. And he's going to do that with local capital. There is no long-term capital. He just has to attract the Spaniards, the Japanese, the Koreans, and that's picking countries from thin air. These are countries in which many corporations have been approaching our think tank, asking us to help them do feasibility studies on airports, on water, on energy, and so on and so forth. In fact, just to inform you, a banker that you know very well, Francis Sebastian, Metro and the Capital, together with the university, have decided to support the government efforts to attract, and I'm going to give you a figure, $15 to $20 billion worth of FDIs year in and year out under his administration. That's a tall order, but that is what Vietnam had been attracting, $15 to $20 billion over the last 5 to 10 years. They're not going to be in export manufacturing. They're going to be precisely in airports, in subways, in railways, in alternative energy, and so on and so forth, in which I'm sure you've read that NINEGA has 3,600 infrastructure projects between 2023 to 2028 worth $370 billion. And we don't have the resources for these. They have to be brought in by FDIs. And let me now just read, just make sure I keep within my 15-minute limit, what I said in a article I wrote for the business world. It says, all these possible FDIs will be facilitated if there's a vehicle for the foreigners to partner with a government agency to be their local counterpart to help them deal with the peculiarities of investing in the Philippines. I'm sure you will agree with me that even a Spanish group like Acciona can own 100% of the Puerto Princesa International Airport. They will think twice before owning it 100%. They will look for a local partner. And in my opinion, if the investment fund is run by the right people, and that is what I would assign to Popoy del Rosario, how to make sure this fund is run by the right people, it will be the best partner. Although the PSA allows 100 foreign ownership when infrastructures, it is very predictable that foreigners would elect to have a minority share to be owned by a domestic institution. What better partner to hold their hands than a government fund? An editorial that appeared in the Inquirer hit the nail on the head when it made the following comments about the so-called Maharlika Fund. If managed properly, such a fund could also be used to bring in more investments into the country by serving as a big brother for foreign capitalists who have the cash but are unfamiliar with the local business landscape. In fact, hand-holding is a role embraced by sovereign wealth funds of other countries, more than 40 of them all over the world, including Indonesia. That has been very successful precisely in this regard. Many of whom regularly partner with foreign businessmen in navigating through treacherous Philippine waters, if they have the assurance of a government entity like the Maharlika Fund in the co-investor in, for example, a massive telecommunications project or a new critically needed highway. You may say, why do we have to duplicate DPP and Land Bank? Well, Mr. Del Rosario was a chief executive in DPP. He may object to my statement. But I say these two banks are loaded with so many other assignments. Help improve education by lending to universities. Help improve health by lending to hospitals. Land Bank, help agrarian for beneficiaries. They do not have to focus on infrastructures, alternative energy, and large-scale corporate investments. In fact, I'm sure you agree with me that banks in the Philippines have been so notorious for willing to pay hundreds of millions of pesos in penalty so that they do not have to invest in agri investments. And that's why I think if we tweak the Maharlika Fund to such a way that its focus will be exclusively on large-scale infrastructures, large-scale agribusiness ventures, and Romy Bernardo has already said this in an article in the same paper, green energy, we will have a lot of international investors plus multilateral investors. I was just reading that the new head of World Bank is focused on climate change. It's amazing how we can have so much carbon credit from large-scale coconut plantations mixed with agroforestry. Now, let me just end by saying what is more controversial, the question of corruption. So, for those who fear incompetence or corruption in the management of the fund, there's constant reference to the Malaysian case. They should be reassured by the provision of Section 16 of the proposed bill by the House of Representatives. The management of what now I call PLIF, Philippine Long-Term Investment Fund, shall be subject to a set of investment policies, guidelines, and risk management limits and procedures as approved by the Board of Directors upon due recommendation of the Advisory Board. Investment and risk management strategies of the PFIF shall be in line with the policies and objective hereunder stated to ensure the long-term viability of the fund. The chairperson of the board will not be a politician. I'm sure you know, he's no longer the president, but will be the Secretary of Finance, a technocrat, a position in the executive department that has always been occupied for the last 40 years by some of the best, brightest, and honest professionals, whatever the quality of the political leadership. This criterion appointing only those among the best and brightest can readily be applied to the key positions of this PLIF. They are the Chief Executive Officer of the fund, President of Land Bank, President of DBP, 5 independent directors from the private sector, the academe, business sector, and the investment sector. The independent director shall be chosen by the advisory body, which shall be composed of the Secretary of the Department of the Budget, Director General of NDA, and 2 members from the Director General of NEDA, and 2 members from the private sector, the President of the Philippine Stock Exchange, and the President of the Bankers Association of the Philippines. And this is a last point, and I'm sorry if I embarrass some of you, because I may mention your names. This is a list that some of you have already read in the business world, just to illustrate the fact that we have a big pool of very, very competent financial executives who can be among these officers and independent directors that I referred to. So I always want to be factual, and I will inform you that there's a list I've sent to the people in Congress who crafted the bill. So again, sorry if I embarrass some of you who are present. Cesar Consing, Roberto de Ocampo, Francis Sebastian, with all due respects, Popoy del Rosario, Anton Periquet, Robert Panlillo, Omar Cruz, Lorenzo Tan, Jericho Laico, Raul de Mesa, Michael de Guzman, Rex Mendoza, Nelo Bautista, Von Montes, Edwin Bautista, Jose de Oro Limcaco, Ramona Francis Arjonillo, Eugene Acevedo, Emmanuel Herbosa, who is just retiring as DVP head, Fabian Lee, Hans Sikat, Antonio Ichon, and Antonio Mancupa. I have looked at names that may even be better than these guys, but I know because I know them personally, they will refuse to accept anything under Marcos Jr. So I did not include them. So I just wanted to illustrate that in terms of management, we can also have the best and the brightest of this Philippine long-term investment fund. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Villegas. With a reminder from our president that we're not here to debate, I was really quite pleased that the discussion was about the use and application of the funds. Definitely, we need resources to invest in agriculture, infra, and communication. Totally agree with you, Dr. Villegas. Now, may I introduce our second speaker. He's currently the chairman of the Institute for Solidarity in Asia, Multi-Sector Governance Council, Armed Forces of the Philippines, and ESG Committee Chair of the Management Association of the Philippines. He is also a Senior Executive Director of PwC Isla Lipana, Independent Director of OmniPay, and DMCI Homes, Vice Chairman of Asia Pacific Network Holdings, and a fellow FINEX member. He is a past president of the Management Association of the Philippines. He was the Development Bank of the Philippines president from 2010 to 2012 and chairman from 1995 to 1998. He was also a director of Metropolitan Bank and Trust Company from 2013 to 2022. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming on stage our second speaker, Mr. Francisco del Rosario, Jr.
Officers of FINEX, members, guests, Dr. Bernardo Villegas, Diwa Guinigundo, good afternoon to all of you. Today, as I face all the members of FINEX, whom I have not seen for a long time, I feel like a prodigal son returning back. But I am definitely happy to be here facing all of you, but nervous because the topic is so much talked about and quite controversial. Coming here this morning, if I may tell you a funny incident, because of the pandemic, I was always wearing slippers, shorts, and t-shirt at home. And then suddenly, I have been invited to this FINEX membership meeting. And so I had to wear my leather shoes, which I had not worn for more than 3 years. And as I was going out of the house, luckily, it did not happen here. The soles of both of my shoes suddenly fell apart and disintegrated. Imagine what would have happened if it happened here. I would have been speaking to all of you without any shoes. Now, I was actually asked here by Dr. Bernie Villegas to be one of the speakers. Bernie was actually my former professor in LaSalle in economics and my mentor and circle head in Opus Dei. So there was no way definitely that I could not have accommodated him. Now I'm sure, especially my friends here, you are now wondering or asking yourselves the question, why is Popoy supporting the MIF? Well, for one, in 1996, when I was the chairman of DBP and the executive director of the Coordinating Council for the Philippine Assistance Program during the term of FBR, I was tasked to create a fund for the infrastructure projects of the country. I was able to solicit the support of World Bank, IFC, and ADB, and the fund was going to be a model for the other Asian countries to follow. World Bank even approved a funding assistance to pay for the initial research and legal work to be done. I was quite excited. We were going to hire a fund manager to operate the fund, and we were bringing private sector partners to be co-partners of the fund. But as always, it didn't push through because it was election time, and the funding assistance was diverted to a local government development fund. That fund could have jump-started and assisted major infrastructure projects in the country and could have helped in bringing in foreign direct investments, as Dr. Villegas was mentioning earlier, which we sorely needed at that time. But anyway, back to the MIF and its latest version based on House Bill number 6608, known as the Maharlika Investment Fund Act. The objectives of the MIF, as stated, are 1, promote economic growth and social development, 2, generate consistent and stable investment returns with appropriate long-term risk limits, 3, obtain the optimal absolute return and achievable financial gains on its investments, and finally, 4, satisfy the requirements of liquidity, safety, security, and yield to ensure profitability. I don't think there is going to be a problem as far as these objectives are concerned, because these are normal and acceptable objectives for a fund. The initial capital has been reduced to US $1.8 to $1.9 billion, which is now actually more realistic and attainable. GSIS and SSS are not mandatory contributors anymore and are only given the option to invest. The same is true for DBP and Land Bank. Initial capital sourcing will come from GFIs with extraordinary performances and earn dividends from the central bank. Future contributions will come from PAGCOR royalties, special assessments on levies from natural resources development, for example, mining, proceeds from government GOCC and military assets, privatization, and borrowings by the fund. For your information, the combined assets of our GOCCs are worth more or less about $323 billion, or half of our GDP. Additional investments can actually also come from GFIs, GOCCs, and from the private sector and multilateral and bilateral institutions, for example, World Bank, IFC, and ADB, plus from the foreign embassies, which will be recommending foreign private sector companies to invest. The government can be a general partner, and the private sector, under a co-investment scheme, can be the limited partners. Government share of net income can be proportionate to its investment in the MIF. Fund sourcing is now diversified and does not rely solely on government pension funds and assets. Based on the allowable investments of the MIF, it has authority to invest in big real estate and infrastructure projects. Developmental projects will be limited to the big projects approved by the NEDA, which, as we all know, is carefully analyzed before being given the final approval by the Investment Coordination Committee. Investment guidelines will be aligned with DTI's target growth in manufacturing, transport, technology, communications, and healthcare. Eventually, as mentioned by Dr. Villegas, this should also include major agribusiness projects, logistics and tourism, and ESG-oriented projects. Based on the investment amount of the contributors to the fund, board seats will be allocated. This has been stated by Dr. Villegas as well. It is recommended that 2 board seats will be reserved for the heads of DBP and Land Bank. The chairman of the board is now proposed to be the Secretary of Finance. Of the 15 board members, 5 will be independent directors from the private sector to be selected by an advisory body. The Chief Executive Officer and Chief Investment Operating Officer will handle the day-to-day operations of the fund. I recommend, though, that a full-time professional fund manager, individual or corporate, be selected to handle the daily investment operations. His performance can be evaluated annually with predetermined performance parameters. Now, as far as transparency, accountability, and proper governance are concerned, 3 auditors will be engaged. 1, an internal auditor reporting to the board. 2, an external auditor, which will be an internationally recognized auditing firm. For example, SGB, as represented by Mr. Wilson Tan, PwC, and others, no? And 3, the Commission on Audit following international best practices. Now, as far as the investment strategy is concerned, the MIF will invest locally and internationally, focusing on development projects. The Board of Directors, together with the Advisory Board, will determine the investment and risk management strategies for the fund. The Advisory Board members, as mentioned by Dr. Villegas, will be the Budget Secretary, Secretary General of NEDA, and 2 private sector members, the President of the Philippine Stock Exchange and the President of the Bankers Association of the Philippines. I will recommend, though, adding the National Treasurer to represent the DOF and a Monetary Board official to represent the BSP. Again, this is acceptable as far as best practices and governance are concerned. Now, just to give you an idea of the sizes of the 10 largest sovereign funds existing as of 2017, let me show you a slide. Okay. The biggest of this is the Norway Government Pension Fund. It's a global fund with $1 trillion. Number 2, the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority with $828 billion. China Investment Corporation, $814 billion. Kuwaiti Investment Authority with $524 billion. Sama Foreign Holdings, $514 billion. Hong Kong Monetary Authority Investment Portfolio, $457 billion. Safe Investment Company, $441 billion. The Government of Singapore Investment Corporation, $359 billion. The Qatar Investment Corporation, $320 billion. And finally, number 10, the National Social Security Fund, $295 billion. There are now more than 100 sovereign wealth funds existing, 108 to be exact. For your information, Indonesia, which is actually comparable to the Philippines, recently launched its sovereign wealth fund, the Indonesian Investment Authority, in 2021. It seeks foreign investors to capitalize the fund rather than relying on commodity revenues. It hopes to attract investments in infrastructure, digitalization, logistics, financial sector, tourism, and supply chains. The initial capital of US $5 billion came from the transfer of government shares in 2 state-owned enterprises. $20 billion to date have actually been raised by this Indonesian SWF for its infrastructure projects. Vietnam also has a sovereign wealth fund among the Asian countries, as well as Malaysia, Korea, Japan, Singapore, and China. With this, let me now state to all of you the benefits that the Philippines can derive from the MIF. Based on the report made by Milken Institute, an international think tank firm, a well-structured SWF can actually attract foreign direct investments, can increase the return on investment in national savings, and can promote growth and social development. It can also help expand the domestic capital market and create a large institutional investor that will allow mobilization of savings within the economy. For long-term investments, including infrastructure, the fund can accumulate surplus wealth that can be recycled and reinvested in high-yielding projects. It will definitely address major infrastructure gaps in our country and provide much-needed funds to the government to deliver basic services without resorting to borrowings. By helping us achieve national development milestones, we can ensure a more sustainable economic growth. Before I end, let me just show you 2 charts, one on risk mitigation and the other on transparency and governance, which are actually important areas to consider when you're about to implement or operate a sovereign wealth fund. Okay. The first chart is about the types of risk and their impact on long-term investment. The type of risk, as you will see from the slide, are market risks, liability risk, valuation, performance, monitoring, and assessment of liquidity needs. Now, what are the impacts of these different types of risks? For market risk, of course, asset allocation, liability, time horizon, and the commitment to the long-term investment strategy as defined by the board. Valuation and performance, again, the commitment to the long-term investment strategy designed by the board and implemented by the staff. Also, public pressure and an important aspect to motivate the members of the staff of the fund, compensation. The other type of risk, monitoring, again, the impact is on the commitment to long-term investment strategy and, again, public pressure. And finally, the assessment of liquidity needs. The impact is on asset allocation. Now, let's look at the last slide, which will deal on the transparency and governance aspects of the fund. The different transparency forms are: one, political, procedural, policy, operational, and performance. And here, if you look at the methods, political, the mission statement will be very important, and the legal framework for the governance structure is also important. Procedural, the board selection procedure. Again, this is important, as Dr. Villegas mentioned. We will have to have competent people appointed to the board. And then the internal and external delegation and the corporate engagement procedures. On policy, it will be the disclosure of investment beliefs and strategic vision and the corporate engagement policy. Operational, the disclosure of internal and external mandates, the disclosure of asset allocation, specific investments, and intended holding periods. And also the corporate engagement actions. And finally, on performance, the short and long-term performance matrix that will have to be defined, the external audits to be conducted, and the qualitative assessment of investment activities and the organizational culture and effectiveness of the fund. Now, with this, I will end with a quotation from Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor, and I quote, "When one door opens, and when one door closes, another opens. But we often look so long and regretfully at the closed door that we do not see the one that has opened for us." So with all of these benefits, I will ask all of you, shall we now enter the open door and start implementing the MIF? Thank you and good afternoon to all.
Thank you, Mr. Del Rosario. Now, moving on to our third and final speaker for today. He graduated cum laude at the University of the Philippines School of Economics. He completed his graduate studies in economics at the London School of Economics as a scholar of the Central Bank of the Philippines. He writes weekly columns for the Manila Bulletin and Business World. He retired in July 2019 from the BSP as Deputy Governor after serving for 41 years, handling monetary policy and operations, international operations, and other various aspects of central banking and macroeconomic policy. A former alternate executive director at the IMF Kuala Lumpur in Kuala Lumpur in 1992 to 1994. He was a vice chairman of both the BSP's Investment Management Committee in Washington, D.C. in 2001, and he was also a research head at the CSEN Center in CSEN Center and the BSP Provident Fund. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome our third speaker, Mr. Diwa Guinigundo.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, President Wilson Tan. and other officers of FINEX, our moderator, Ms. Riza, Mantaring, friends, ladies, and gentlemen. Let me clarify that there is very little difference between House Bill 6398 and Senate Bill 1670 with respect to the key aspects of putting up an investment fund rather than a sovereign wealth fund. The Senate bill sponsored by Senator Mark Villar, which might be used as a template for crafting the final version of the Maharlika Investment Fund, went through public hearings, I would say abbreviated public hearings, and 3 meetings of the technical working groups. Within this week, Senator Villar continues to consult with key people in groups. Other senators, I understand, are also preparing their own amendments they intend to introduce at the plenary. My comments this afternoon are therefore based on the original version of Senator Villar's bill that already reflects the House bill that dropped the pension funds from both the GSIS and the SSS. So that's the existing version. The whole point of my presentation this afternoon is that we can make better use of our time, public money, and efforts if we are to drop the idea of having a sovereign wealth fund as it is crafted today. Now, Bernie was telling us that there could be modification, and Popoy was also telling us that there needs to be some tweaking in the Maharlika Investment Fund. Now, short of that, I think it is important that we reconsider this idea of a Maharlika Investment Fund as it is crafted today. But make no mistake about it. We need FDIs because our domestic saving is not enough. But you don't need an MIF to attract FDIs. We should invest as a people in our future in terms of infrastructure, human capital development, labor productivity, and technological innovations. But timing here is very critical, and we must not lose sight of the fact that we are short of funds. Source the funding from our surplus fund. But if we don't have surplus fund, and we don't have any, and we get it from existing GFIs, government financial institutions, GOCCs, government-owned and controlled corporations, and dividends from the monetary authorities, the BSP, there will be a hole in the budget. Magkakaroon ng butas ang budget, which the NG will have to cover from somewhere else, through borrowings, higher taxes, or both. In short, find the funding from sources without unintended consequences. We must always aspire for equilibrium, for sources without collateral harm. The MIF is proposed to be established with support from sources already earmarked in the budget. And under the one single fund concept, when you take off from these sources of funding, dividends from GFIs, GOCCs, and BSP, then there is a hole in the budget. And you have to cover that hole through higher borrowings or higher taxes, or if they are not enough, from both. Now, as early as February 2, 2023, nearly a week after Senator Villar filed Senate Bill 1670, proposing the creation of the Maharlika Investment Fund, Senator Alan Peter Cayetano correctly urged the Philippine Senate to focus its efforts instead on pressing issues, including inflation and food shortages. I will share his view. Unless the fundamental flaws are addressed, I am afraid we should drop the Maharlika idea. So what are we trying to do in pushing for the MIF? First chart, please. My first objection to the MIF is that the objectives are unclear and quite vague. While MIF is to invest national funds, these are not new money because they shall be extracted from the GFIs and the GOCCs and the BSP, instead of being used to strengthen our central monetary authority. It will also be sequestered to form this new corporation to run the MIF. Instead of allowing these institutions, meaning the GFIs, current set of treasury people to manage their own funds, the MIF will be set up as another layer to coordinate and strengthen their investment activities. This is costly and presumptuous, but these GFIs are not doing their job. Remember, sovereign wealth funds are established to preserve and enhance windfall earnings from privatization of public assets, fiscal surpluses, and windfall profits from commodity exports or even metal sales. What is there to preserve and enhance when the money will be coming from neither of those usual sources, but will be funded from public deposit? What is there to preserve and enhance when we have no surplus funds to speak of? Next chart. Creating an MIF is untimely. That's my second reservation about it. The Philippines has no surplus funds whatsoever. Instead, what we have are serious balance of payments deficit, large fiscal deficit reaching historical highs in excess of 6% of GDP. And as a result, the government itself has been incurring higher and higher public borrowings. As of January 2023, public sector borrowing reached 13.7 trillion, and presumably that is in excess of 61% of GDP. We have nothing to invest at this point as a nation in terms of running a sovereign wealth fund or even as an MIF as it is crafted today. The meaning of this situation is that we are faced instead with the urgent need of our people for more food supply, better medical facilities, and quality education. It would be no different from a father who would rather invest in some speculative schemes the money that is supposed to cover his family's need for food and medicine, as well as the tuition fees for his children's education. Third slide. My third objection about the MIF is that the sources of funding are most destabilizing. And here, I have 4 points. First point, diversion of funds from GFIs and GOCCs to establish the MIF spells big trouble. The MIF is proposed to be funded by investment from GFIs, GOCCs, and the same GFIs that needed public support during the pandemic. Yes, during the pandemic, the national government had to flung in sizable amount of money to provide help and assistance to both Land Bank and DBP. And here, in the MIF, they are being asked to cut off 25 billion from DBP and 50 billion from Land Bank. Diversion of funds from GFIs to MIF for investment purposes would therefore force the national government to borrow funds to compensate for the loss of these earmarked funds to sustain government operations. This is also true when GOCC funds are used for the MIF. Second point, using GFIs for MIF could affect their financial health and may result in potential bank run and financial instability. GFI's investable funds earmarked to MIF are deductible from the regulatory capital. Therefore, these GFIs could be constrained from both lending to key areas of the economy and investing in other infrastructure and social development projects. Now, this could then potentially cause contagion and trigger a series of bank runs, especially now that the banking system's balance sheets have arguably weakened during the pandemic. Third point, mandating GFIs as contributors with promise of regulatory relief from BSP also distorts the regulatory environment. For instance, measures to safeguard deposits might need to be eased to facilitate their proposed contributions to the MIF. Doing such would introduce unfair competitive implications for the other banks. Likewise, such excessive regulatory forbearance may lead to undercalculation of their overall risk profile and may adversely affect the safety and soundness of their operations. And finally, MIF can constrain GFI's flexibility in their investment and lending strategy. By mandating them to invest in MIF, their flexibility to diversify their portfolio could be affected. By allowing future exposure to MIF in the form of debt securities could also result in over-concentration of loans and affect loan portfolio of GFIs because there is a provision in both versions of the House and the Senate that the government will guarantee such investment to the MIF. Now, such guarantee will therefore increase the contingent liability of the national government. Now, GFI should be given the flexibility to determine their overall investment strategy consistent with their business model, target market, and strategy for keeping their competitiveness as well as profitability. Item number 4, my fourth reservation. The MIF, by requiring the BSP dividends to be earmarked for the MIF, actually violates the independence of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. I have 3 points here. Let me quickly clarify that it is not just the seed fund of the MIF that the BSP dividends will be financing. Seed fund, yes, but henceforth, with some variation, all the dividends of the BSP shall be assigned to the MIF, not only on the first 2 years, but forever and ever. This could put the country's sole monetary authority's independence and credibility at risk because it preempts the use of its declared dividends and income to the MIF rather than to building up its capitalization from 50 billion to 200 billion or an additional 150 billion based on the charter of the BSP, based on the amended BSP charter by Congress. Now, this would be problematic since the BSP's ability to perform its mandate of safeguarding price and financial stability is also determined by the adequacy of its resources. But with lower capitalization, the BSP's conduct of monetary policy could be seriously impaired. Ladies and gentlemen, the intent of the Maharlika Bill contradicts both the Constitution and the law that guarantee the independence and autonomy of the BSP. Without these two attributes, the BSP will never be able to succeed in doing its job. Now, some would argue that even with the mere 50 billion capitalization, the BSP has succeeded in maintaining price and financial stability by expanding its balance sheet. Given the ongoing pandemic, the large fiscal deficit and higher public debt, coupled with the sustained uncertainty in the global markets, it is important to ensure that the BSP's balance sheet remains appropriately disciplined. Bloating the BSP's balance sheet could be inflationary and therefore it might promote financial instability. My fifth reservation is that without proper safeguards, the MIF could be a potential channel for corruption and bad governance. The so-called sovereign wealth funds succeed in an environment of good governance, rules-based public management, and the absence of special interest groups. Now, experiences from other countries show that without good governance, SWFs are prone to mismanagement. Now, the authors, both in the House and the Senate, are invoking the Santiago Principles. Now, remember that the 24 Santiago Principles are voluntary in terms of compliance. And therefore, that in itself, the Santiago Principles in itself, could not guarantee good governance. Adherence to it will, but compliance is voluntary. Now, it bears noting too, okay, that yes, if we are able to appoint competent, highly meritorious individuals to the board and to manage the MIF, and yet SB 1670 proposes to exempt the MIF from the GOCC Governance Act of 2011. It also proposes to exempt the MIF from Government Procurement Reform Act, the Salary Standardization Act, the payment of taxes and customs duties on any imports and supplies and equipment. These laws ensure adherence to good governance, and therefore, exempting the MIF from such laws is like giving it a blanket authority to abuse. There are other issues that I wish to address, and there are 4 of them, and I'm going to do it quickly. Number 1, we are short of FDIs. MIF can be leveraged to attract more FDIs. I agree that the budget constraint is quite serious, given the persistently high fiscal deficit and the burgeoning high public sector debt, which ended January 2023 with 13.7 trillion, or some 61% of GDP. I also agree that domestic saving is not enough. We need FDIs, no doubt. But in the Philippine economic literature, nowhere have we found anything that because we don't have a sovereign wealth fund, FDIs have not been forthcoming. In a recent BSP paper, okay, on ASEAN competition for FDI, several factors have been found to be critical. And what are they? Credit ratings, efficiency of doing business, quality of human capital, and good governance. Good governance is correlated with ease of doing business, quality of infra, competitive industrial performance, and technological innovations. No mention of SWFs. Second, MIF can harden legal frameworks and in the process attract more FDIs. This is my response to that comment. For decades, the World Bank, ADB, US Exim Bank, JICA, JEXIM, NITI, KEXIM, not to mention Citi, JP Morgan, Mizuho, ANZ, and many other foreign banks have been financing big-ticket infrastructure projects without legal impediments and without an MIF. The ADB, World Bank, JBIC have been doing co-financing and partial credit guarantees. Large dams such as San Roque Multipurpose and the 2 billion Malampaya Camago offshore with 600-kilometer deep ocean underwater pipe were financed as public-private partnership. Thirdly, it can serve as efficient vehicle. My response is that what we need today is to maximize the national budget as funded from tax and non-tax revenues, as well as from loans and dividends from the BSPs, GOCCs, and GFIs. Instead of funding public projects to create jobs, promote trade, expand infra, and invest first, Therefore, in the process, more layers of bureaucracy are formed, more potential leakages are established. And finally, the MIF can realize high returns of as much as 6 to 11%. The MIF champions argue that the fund can achieve high levels of returns. This must be based on the assumption that both the DBP and Land Bank only invest in low-yielding government securities. This is actually a requirement imposed by the Department of Finance itself for the privilege of being exclusive depositories of GOCCs. They have to invest 50% of the GOCCs deposits in liquid safe government securities. If they are given the latitude to invest in equally profitable instruments other than government debt instruments, I'm sure these GFIs will perform better. Finally, what are the macroeconomic consequences of the MIF? First, by shifting the funds from the GFIs, GOCCs, and the BSP, the NG is actually burying itself in greater mess. It will have to find alternative sources in terms of higher borrowings or higher taxes or both. This is bad news for all of us. Second, by earmarking for future BSP dividends to itself, MIF is effectively violating the Philippine Constitution and the BSP Charter that calls for its independence and autonomy. That act of earmarking the dividends instead of using it for recapitalization will lengthen the complete recapitalization of the BSP by 9 years, from 8 years with dividends to 17 years with dividends going to the MIF. That's a long 9 years additional. That is bad news for us consumers and banks and bank deposits because a weak central bank may not be up to the job of providing assistance when crisis should strike. The BSP needs a healthy balance sheet. Third, by mandating the Land Bank and the DBP to contribute 50 billion and 25 billion to the seed fund of the MIF, it is in effect depriving them of being able to implement diversification and avoiding over-concentration of investment to single recipient. If anything adverse should happen, that situation could lead to bank runs and financial instability. And finally, by exempting it from any laws of the land that ensure transparency and accountability, full disclosure, we might be unwittingly abetting weak governance and opening up opportunity for corruption. That would weaken market confidence, credit rating, and pull back economic activities. I would like Popoy, end up with a quote. This is one of the least quoted admission of limitation of Sir Isaac Newton himself in the Royal Society of England. He said, I can calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. In the Maharlika Investment Fund, high estimates of quantitative returns on investment placed with Maharlika could easily get us excited. But it's difficult to spread it all. With those fundamental issues as funding sources that would compromise the independence and autonomy of our monetary authorities. This would compromise the ability to establish price and financial stability that is so much precious to investment, economic recovery, growth, and full employment. Using public deposit from the GFIs could possibly trigger market fear and ultimately bank run. In short, we have nothing to invest or to make money from. My equally basic objection to this scheme is giving it a wide variety of exemptions from various laws on privacy, civil service, audit, and accountability. Its board of directors and board of advisors are given so much latitude on the kind of investment the fund can do. We can all calculate the returns on future investments of Maharlika. But with so much latitude on what people can do, we can take heart of what Newton warned us against: the madness of people, the possible abuse of power. We need to learn from our own history and those of other sovereign wealth funds where issues of bad governance resulted in huge losses and plunder of public money. We don't want to be the last to know. Thank you very much.
Thank you, former Deputy Governor Guinigundo. That was such a passionate presentation. I'm sure all of us were listening and nobody has left. Now we come to the most exciting part of the program, which is the panel discussion. May I invite all of our speakers to join us on stage for the open forum. And to moderate this open forum, may I call the Board Director of Sun Life, GREPA Financial and FINEX Chairperson for National Affairs Committee, Ms. Riza Mantaring, to join us on stage as well.
I think those presentations were really very informative, and certainly the whole time I was listening to them, trying to really trying to take everything in. No? The questions, please send them through Viber at this number, okay? And we will be reading them from this our Viber. Okay, let me start with a few questions for them, and then we'll start taking questions from the audience. I think all our three panelists are agreed, no? Well, you might have diverging views on the MIF. You are agreed that the sources of funds are problematic, and agreed that the BSP should not be included. Land Bank, DBP, I think you said there's a possibility you can use it depending on how the funds are used. Dr. Villegas, I have a first question for you. No? You're advocating foreign direct investment, and that the fund can be used to attract more foreign investments in. But when investors assess whether to invest in a country, they look at things like stability, policy stability, rule of law, contractual rights, and corruption. And the Philippines, unfortunately, in recent years, has not done well on those factors. No? So, in fact, some years ago, we actually had a fund very similar to MIF, which was intended for infrastructure. A multilateral had already funded the initial setup of the fund, and then the government decided to use the fund for other purposes because elections were coming up. So if you're an investor, how can you be assured that the money you put in will be used in the manner in which it's intended, and that it's not going to be used for other purposes?
Well, I start with the premise that the Philippines is no longer the sick man of Asia. If you take a look at all the prognostications, the Philippines is rated among the fastest growing economies together with Vietnam and India in the next 5 years. So we're very different from the past notoriety that we had. And that's why I have personal experience of foreign investors coming to our office precisely saying, we are impressed by the sources of growth of the Philippines. $36 billion worth of overseas remittances, $32 billion worth of BPO IT, which we see as constant. In fact, it was tested during the pandemic. They hardly actually were affected. So that's why I said we have a critical mass of attractive features, both from the standpoint of better governance. I'm not going to say this because DOI is here. We have the best central banking system in Southeast Asia, thanks to more than 30 years of constant institution building. And you can say that about other agencies we have. You know, constantly talk about corruption, but think of how competently a lot of our government agencies have been run by some of the best people, no matter how poor political governance was over the last 30 years. I always remind people, for example, that even under the worst president we had, Erap, because we kicked him out, you had Jokno and Medalla, who we now recognize as one of the best, as part of his cabinet. No? So foreigners see those changes. And that's why, despite the fact that we still have corruption, now don't get this as my belittling the efforts to fight corruption. South Korea became a first world country, and South Korea is still very corrupt. Malaysia is already a high income country. You know what Malaysia's reputation has been. So corruption is not the obstacle to becoming first world. It's stupid economic policies and weak institutions. That's what I have studied as an economist. I'm not saying this to somehow decrease our effort to remove corruption. I fight corruption because of morality, not because of economic reasons. No? And I see foreigners perceiving that there was already a change in 2011 when we started, as I said, growing at 6 to 7% without fail for 10 years before the pandemic. Now the pandemic happened with a big drop, but if you take a look at what happened, almost instantly we recovered because of those stronger institutions and better policies to which Duterte, who was not the best president from the standpoint of political qualification, contributed by the build, and by having his people with enough creativity to change the restrictions against foreign investments without constitutional change, which I think is definitely not needed at this moment. I'm completely against any change in the Constitution, not because I was part of those who crafted the Constitution. I see a lot of weaknesses there, but I agree with all the statements. We have enough problems that we don't want a distraction.
So one of the questions asked, talking about the changes that have been made to liberalize the economy, we have the PSA Act and other acts that have opened up the economy that were passed that until now don't have any IRRs. Why don't we implement those first rather than go into an MIF? If you started something and then kinalimutan mo na, you're off to something else. Maybe the PSA will accomplish what you want to accomplish of bringing in FDIs.
No, but we can do both. Definitely the IRR is needed. And I know that people are working on it. So, I mean, it's not an either or. No?
Yeah. Maybe I can ask Popo, because you also talked of sources of funds, no? And you were talking earlier about other potential sources of funds, since you all agree this is problematic. You talked about the other sovereign wealth funds. Well, Norway has it from its oil surplus, right? Singapore from their surplus balance of payments position, all their excess dollars that they're earning. We don't have that, as DG Diwa pointed out. What other sources of funds are possible for us to fund MIF without touching these GFIs, given all the issues already pointed out in the presentation of DG Diwa?
Actually, if you look at the existing funds, the funding sources came from two general sources, commodity and non-commodity. As far as the Philippines is concerned, I think we can rely on one, the asset disposal and privatization. I'm talking about the GOCCs. There are about, as I mentioned, 30 of the 108 GOCCs. They already have $323 billion as far as assets are concerned. And then in our natural resource development, we can also impose levies on mining, for example. And then, of course, if you bring in private investors and the multilaterals and bilaterals to also invest in the fund, that will also increase the amount of money that will be in the fund.
So you're saying the multilaterals, asset sales?
Asset privatization, sale. Not only the GOCCs, but also if you look at the AFP military properties, the camps and the different properties of the AFP, that can also be privatized or developed jointly with a joint venture sharing.
Okay. Diwa, you pointed out a lot of issues, no, with the fund as it is, and said that there are all these concerns, no, the sources of funding, corruption, etc., exemption from governance, from taxes. There are fundamental issues that you pointed out. If those fundamental issues are addressed, like what are the maybe top issues that you would want addressed to make such a fund acceptable? What do you think can be done to tweak it? Because realistically, the fund may not really go away, as you know. So what can we do to fix it?
I mean, if we
acceptable?
address all the fundamental issues that we raised, there's no MIF. There's no MIF. If we have, let's say, what Popeye was saying in terms of asset sale, that's one possible source of funding. Contribution from the multilateral agencies and even bilaterals, if they wish to invest in the Philippines, by all means, they can be constituted into one fund dedicated to infrastructure and large-scale agricultural activities. Fine. But if we are to build an investment fund or a sovereign wealth fund, let's source the funding without unintended consequences, without collateral damage to the economy. The funding from the GOCCs, the GFIs, and the BSP itself, this will be taken basically from the budget. And where does the national government get the substitute funds? Borrowings, taxes, or both? So if you leave the sources of funding as they are specified in both houses and the Senate, fine. Okay, that's number one. Number two, if we are to address the issues that we raised, I'm not sure if the proponents will agree that you don't exempt the Maharlika Investment Fund from those important laws that ensure transparency, full disclosure, and accountability. These are the hallmarks, these are the basis of good governance. And without good governance, those sovereign wealth funds are basically not going to serve anything. Okay? That's how one MDB, that's the fiasco of the one MDB. There was so much authority given to the Prime Minister with respect to the one MDB. There is a second sovereign wealth fund of Malaysia, and it is also going through a very difficult situation today, again, because of bad governance. So, yes, we can always talk about appointing very good management and chief executive and finance officers. Fine, that's part of good governance. But if you provide so much latitude in what the board and in what this fund can do, okay, put to the exemption from this very important laws that ensure transparency and accountability, I don't think it will go far.
Yeah. There's a related question to that coming from the audience for you. You said that the MIF is untimely. What economic or government factor should be present that will make it timely to establish an MIF investment, an MIF?
Well, sovereign wealth funds are established on the basis of surplus fund. To the extent that we have surplus fund, don't touch the GFIs, don't touch the GOCCs, don't touch the BSP, fine, you can establish that. Of course, you also have to balance this off with the need of our people. Okay? We have a very large fiscal deficit, more than 6%. Public sector borrowing is more than 61%. And our balance of payments is not doing very well. Last year, it was more than $7 billion in deficit. And the current account, which is also another way of looking at the insufficiency of domestic savings, is more than $17 billion in deficit. And then you will be investing so much while you have urgent needs for hospitals and classrooms, or medicine, etc.
But can't you use the fund to invest in those, for example?
No, that's part of the budget.
So unnecessary,
Yeah.
in effect, you're saying. So there's another question from the audience. In 2022, the DOF required the three GFIs, SSS, GSIS, PhilHealth, to correct their FS for non-compliance of PFRS 4. I'm sorry, I don't know what PFRS 4. Can one of the accountants say what it is? But this resulted in a reduction of their equity and recognition of additional liability by 9.5 trillion pesos. These GFIs have negative equity of 7.5 trillion. Shouldn't their priority be strengthening their financial condition instead of supporting the MIF? Well, actually, SSS and GSIS are no longer included. But similarly, I guess Land Bank, DBP, BSP also have to shore up their financial conditions, right? So,
Remember, during the pandemic, the GFIs received subsidies from the government because their balance sheets were also weak, and the BSP's capitalization remained at 50 billion today, despite the provision of the new charter allowing the allocation of its dividends to beef up itself. But the Maharlika Investment Fund bill assigns 100% of the profit of the dividend to the MIF, directly to the MIF. And then on the third year, up to the time that the 150 billion peso capitalization of the BSP is completed, all subsequent dividends will be earmarked for the MIF forever and ever.
yeah, Dr. Villegas, you want to comment on that, or you agree? Okay, no comment there. There's another, well, actually, I have a question here, no? The MIF potentially will compete with the private sector in implementing projects. In fact, one of the fears is that it could be used to fund crony enterprises. So it will be competing with the private sector. And it's exempt from taxes. It has inherent advantages, no, exempt from taxes. It will even be given regulatory relief in case of problems. So one of the best practices in other more advanced economies is that where government participates in areas where the private sector participates, it should do so on the same basis, with a level playing field. The MIF does not do that. It gives advantages to those that are involved in it. So how do we address that issue of interference? Because the fear is that because of their advantages, it could dominate the other institutions to the point that it can bully other institutions. It can take over other institutions. And we've seen examples very recently where private industries were at risk of being taken over. So how do you address that?
Assuming that the sources will come mostly from multilateral institutions and foreign investors who are interested in the Philippine market. So I start with the assumption that we are now attractive to people with savings abroad who, precisely like those in Spain, in Japan, in Korea, no longer can make use of their savings profitably because there is disappearing from this planet. They cannot build more infrastructure. There are more than enough infrastructures in Spain. But they still have a lot of competence in building airports, running airports, and they see the Philippines as a very juicy market. And so I'm assuming precisely that at this point of our shifting from a low middle income economy to a high middle income, we are very attractive to savings from abroad. And so that's why we must have an instrument that will partner with those people who are interested in coming here to supplement our domestic capital. Even the banks right now are having difficulties, as you very well know. Interest rates are going up. It's very difficult to borrow right now from our banks. And even the Ramonsis of the world, the Manny Pangilinan of the world, no longer can repeat what they did during the Duterte administration in investing in more infrastructures. They have very limited capacity. And in fact, you see some of them looking at new opportunities like the Metro Pacific Group, seeing precisely that now there is a tremendous opportunity for agribusiness. That's why they've never been in agribusiness. They're now investing heavily. So you see that there's a shift of attention towards precisely what I consider areas in which a lot of profit can be made if we have the technology and the ability to mechanize more and more of this operation. And the technology is found precisely among our neighbors. No?
So basically, you're also saying to be sure it's targeted investment, right? Yes, Mr.
Well, Bernie was talking about the attractiveness of the Philippine economy to foreign investors and even multilaterals. I completely agree. In fact, since 1999, we have been recording uninterrupted, continuous, consecutive economic growth, positive economic growth, with the exception of the pandemic years. Okay. The point is this. If we are able to institutionalize good governance here, if we are able to make sure that public policy does not change in midstream, we are able to address red tape and bureaucracy in government, okay? I don't think we need an MIF to attract those funds coming here. If we can promise to them, okay, that it's going to be a level playing field, important laws on governance will be observed and implemented by the authorities. No more extrajudicial killing along the side, along the streets, etc., etc. I think we can attract sizable amount of foreign direct investment. Bernie was saying that they have reached their saturation point in their respective economies. They could no longer extend their roads and bridges beyond their lands, no? And therefore they have extra capacity to do it here. So as long as they are convinced that based on the so-called Transparency International's rating of the Philippines, perception of corruption, etc., etc., if we are able to address all of this, and we have the laws, on transparency, on freedom of information, etc., by all means, even without an MIF.
We actually, people say we have some of the best laws, except they're not implemented. Yeah, please.
Actually, one of the advantage of the fund is that the fund will also be building a pipeline of good projects, good investable projects. So a foreign investor will come to agree or no that if they go to the fund will be able to provide them a long list of good investable projects for them to look at. That should be one of the priorities of the fund, to build up a pipeline of good projects which could be invested in. Secondly, the fund can also create a good criteria for making, what makes a good investable project. Is it a good business plan? Is it, So if these investors go to the fund, they're assured that these projects that they're going to look at and invest in are good investable projects.
But that's the job of NEDA. That's the job of the DTI. That's the job of the Department of Agriculture. We have the PPP Center, That's the job of the Department of Transportation, to identify investable projects of national importance. In fact, they have already identified some flagship projects. Why do we need an MIF to do this? It's a duplication of existing institutions that are presently addressing the issue of how to attract foreign investment into the Philippines. If we are interested in tourism, that's the job of the Department of Tourism or the Philippine Tourism Authority, the PTA, or the private sector. All we need to do is to have good governance, to have a government that does not compete with the private sector, a government that enables and empowers rather than hinders and pulls back private initiative.
We have a last question here, which I think you've already answered, so I'd like to hear the answer of Popoy and Dr. Villegas. No? From the audience, there's a question. It seems to me that the MIF is an answer looking for a question, a solution begging for a problem. Can you honestly and candidly say that the MIF is critical to addressing the problems and achieving the objectives presented? Who would like to answer first?
First of all, let me address what Diwa said. There are a lot of agencies, DTI, etc. These people are not business investment managers. In my view, the Philippine long-term investment fund is going to be made up of people who are very steep in the skills of investment management. I mean, for example, I'm very close to the chair of BOI because he was a professor, Mr. Pedro Rodolfo. They talk about trillions of pledges that are made by foreigners. They never come to fruition because all these different agencies do not know how to package projects. In my concept, whatever you call it, that investment fund should have people who have tremendous experience in packaging projects and being precisely the minority shareholder in a Marubeni trying to put up a railway from Laguna to Bicol, or putting up all sorts of data centers all over the country right now. It's a tremendous opportunity for the Philippines to be attracting a lot of data centers. So my concept of this long-term investment fund is a group of people who are very skillful in investment banking, which does not exist in other government agencies. In fact, I sat in the board during the time of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo in the National Development Company. With all due respect to those who, I don't know who are now running that, the government is never an expert institution to actually start investing in strategic businesses. You know exactly what happened to all the companies that NDC invested in. They all went kaput, no? Now, why do you think? I think that a long-term investment fund can do better precisely because we now have a pool of these people who can use their experiences as investment managers to actually take the list of NEDA, take the list of DTI, take the list of all those agencies, and bring them to fruition in actual investments.
Thank you.
Well, we have to look at the strategy of the fund. The strategy of the fund basically invests, it's a long-term strategy. So if it's a long-term strategy, that means it's not affected by short-term blips, fluctuations, or disruptions. So within the long term, your investment will improve, hopefully, no? Because these are not affected by short-term blips. Secondly, as you know, one of our major problems here is bringing in more foreign direct investments. We've been basically funding growth through borrowings. As you know, our debt to GDP, our foreign borrowings have increased. So if there is a vehicle that can help bring in more foreign direct investments, then we should try this. One, to bring in the FDIs, and second, to more or less fill in the infrastructure funding gap that we have right now.
Thank you very much. I think that's all the time we have left. We'd like to thank our speakers very much. We certainly learned a lot from you this afternoon, no? And thank you also for patiently answering the questions. Maybe just to summarize, the MIF, we agreed sources of funding are problematic, but we've also discussed a potential way forward, which, if addressed, could make this a very attractive vehicle for attracting more investments into the country and accelerating our future growth, if these are addressed. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Dr. Villegas, Mr. Rosario, former Deputy Governor Guinigundo, and to Ms. Riza Mantaring as well for moderating the open forum. Now let me invite on stage our President Wilson to award the token of appreciation to our speakers. Isa-isa lang. Naglo-closing ka pa, no? Naglo-closing ka? Yun na yung close mo? Maybe just a photo for,
Bubuksan ba natin? Hindi na.
hindi na.
Okay. Hindi na lang natin. Kailangan ba ito nila?
Well, with that, we'd like to thank everyone who has joined us this afternoon, and we hope to see you in future FINEX events. Thank you. Close mo pa?
Meeting adjourned.